is a hollow vessel, something less than human. A body without empathy, without remorse. He chose destruction. He chose evil. He feels nothing.
The 13th of November, 2022. A quiet college town wakes up to a silence so deep it feels unnatural. 4 University of Idaho students, Madison Mogan, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, are found brutally murdered in their off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho. What police find inside that house isn't just tragic, it's carnage. When officers step through the door, they're not met with chaos, but with something worse: organized horror, blood on the walls, multiple victims in their beds, unrecognizable, wounds that indicate a frenzy, yet also precision. It doesn't look like a random killing. It looks intentional. But the killer left something behind: a knife sheath, military grade, and with it, a trace of DNA. Weeks passed. No suspect, no confession. The fear grew, and so did the questions. Why were 2 roommates left alive? Why didn't anyone hear the screams? And who could carry out something this vicious, then vanish without a trace? Then came the name: Bryan Kohberger, a PhD student in criminology, a man who studied murder, motive, behavior, and now, allegedly, committed one of the most shocking mass killings in recent U.S. history. But as investigators peel back the layers of the case, a disturbing new picture begins to form. Court documents once sealed are now public, and inside them are answers no one was prepared for. Audio of screams, testimonies from survivors, smudged fingerprints, phone data, and cold-blooded dialogue between the killer and police. It's all there filed, time-stamped, and chillingly detailed. This is not a case of impulse. This is method. This is planning. This is someone who wanted to be the smartest man in the room and thought he could outplay everyone. But why them? Why those 4? And most of all, what kind of mind crafts a murder so silent, so savage, then simply drives away into the dark? He was not a drifter, not a dropout, not someone society had written off. Bryan Christopher Kohberger was the kind of man who looked like he should have been on the other side of the courtroom, not in chains. A PhD student in criminal justice and criminology at Washington State University, just a short drive from the crime scene. He was, quite literally, studying the minds of killers. The irony is surgical. Born in Pennsylvania in 1994, Kohberger grew up in the Pocono Mountains. Those who knew him described him in fragments: quiet, intelligent, socially awkward, sometimes intensely analytical. He had battled heroin addiction in his teens, but later cleaned up, went back to school, and excelled academically. From the outside, it was a redemption arc, but there were fissures beneath the surface. Reports from former classmates and acquaintances paint a disturbing portrait: obsession with control, struggles with empathy, and an eerie fascination with violent crime. He once posted anonymously in online forums about feeling no emotion, and described his detachment from people and the world around him. Even more chilling, he allegedly conducted surveys with convicted criminals, asking them about their thought process before committing a crime. Not why they did it, but how. It's unclear when Kohberger crossed the line between studying evil and becoming it, but somewhere along the way, the observer became the subject. His field of study became a blueprint. He wasn't watching from the gallery anymore, he had stepped onto the stage. He lived alone, rarely socialized, was vegan to a point of obsession, kept his phone off for long stretches of time, later revealed to coincide with critical moments in the case. But what was the motive? There was no known connection to the victims, no history of conflict, no direct communication. And yet, cell phone data placed Kohberger near the victim's home a dozen times prior to the murders, as if he was studying them. Was it a thrill kill? A test of theory? A personal vendetta no one else could see? Or was this the final thesis of a man who wanted to prove he understood the mind of a killer by becoming one? The house at 1122 King Road stood quietly on a slope in Moscow, Idaho, a rental home filled with the sounds of young life, laughter, music, roommates coming and going. But in the early hours of the 13th of November, 2022, that sound was replaced by something else, something no one heard yet would never forget. It began around 4 a.m., Inside the house were 6 people. By the end of the night, 4 would be dead. The killer came prepared, armed with a large military-style Ka bar knife. It wasn't a moment of rage. It was an execution. Investigators believe the killer entered through a sliding glass door, quietly moving through the second floor. There, he encountered Zana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin, the only male victim, and the only one not living in the house. Officer Corbin Smith's report is gruesome and clinical. Zana was found on the floor, wearing a sweatshirt and underwear, her hands showing signs of deep defensive wounds. Blood soaked the carpet. Her boyfriend Ethan was on the bed, stabbed multiple times, including a gash to the neck. Blood covered the walls. The sheets were saturated. On the 3rd floor, Madison Mogan and Kaylee Goncalves, best friends since childhood, lay in the same bed. Madison's face was described as completely disfigured. Kaylee's injuries were severe, multiple stab wounds, their bodies pale and cold. One officer later admitted he couldn't even understand what he was seeing. At first, it looked inhuman, but the killer made a mistake. Beside Madison's body, investigators found a knife sheath, black, left behind. On it, a trace of DNA that didn't belong to any of the victims. It would later match DNA found in trash outside the Kohberger family home, over 2,500 miles away. There were other signs too. Footprints in the snow, smudged fingerprints on a glass door, a black backpack discarded near the house. The room's nightstand had been moved, pushed awkwardly against the wall, perhaps in a struggle. And then there were the survivors. One roommate reported hearing a scream. Then footsteps, a male voice. "You're going to be fine. I'm going to help you." She locked herself in her room, terrified. No one called 911 until nearly 8 hours later. Why? Shock, confusion, maybe fear that what they heard wasn't real. But it was. 4 lives ended within minutes, brutally, precisely, silently. This wasn't random. It was studied, calculated. Someone knew how to move through that house. Someone who had rehearsed the kill in his mind long before he ever held the blade. And that someone left a single At first, there were no suspects, no motive, no surveillance footage. And in a town as small as Moscow, Idaho, that kind of silence was deafening. For weeks, the public was left in fear, and investigators in darkness. But the killer had left traces, tiny ones, and for the team assigned to this case, that was enough. The first breakthrough came from the knife sheath, a U.S. Marine Corps Ka bar cover, left at the crime scene, beside Madison Mogan's body. DNA was recovered from the snap button. It didn't match any in local databases, but it was a seed. The FBI and local police began cross-referencing consumer DNA databases using advanced familial tracing techniques, and eventually, a partial match led them to a trash can outside the home of Bryan Kohberger's parents in Pennsylvania. That DNA sample? A match to the sheath. But that wasn't the only link. Cell phone tower data showed a device belonging to Kohberger, pinging near the victim's home at least 12 times before the murders, but never connecting during the window of the crime. Investigators later learned the phone had been turned off for several hours, precisely when the killings occurred. Intentional. Even more suspicious? He returned to the scene hours later, with the phone now on, perhaps to observe the aftermath, or to admire it. The white Hyundai Elantra. Surveillance cameras captured a car matching Kohberger's vehicle circling the neighborhood multiple times before the attack and speeding away from the scene just minutes after. That same model was registered to Kohberger at Washington State University. In the background, agents compiled psychological profiles, tracked his academic work, and discovered he had submitted online surveys asking criminals how they selected victims and committed crimes. The killer wasn't just hiding. He was watching the investigation unfold. Then came the turning point. On the 30th of December, 2022, Bryan Kohberger was arrested at his parents' home across the country in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. He didn't resist, but his first words to police weren't denials. They were questions. Why am I here? Was it about what happened in Moscow? I think I need a lawyer. He knew. The documents show the interview was short, polite, measured. Kohberger said he studied criminal justice because he once dreamed of becoming a police officer. that he took interest in the minds of criminals not because he was like them, but because he wanted to understand them. But everything, the DNA, the phone data, the car, the knife, the timing pointed to something else. He wasn't trying to understand killers. He was trying to be one and get away with it. When Bryan Kohberger first entered the courtroom, there were no shackles on his expression, no breakdown, no visible remorse, just a cold, analytical calm, as if he wasn't the one on trial but the one observing it. The courtroom itself was a battlefield of grief and silence. Families of the victims sat just feet away from the man accused of slaughtering their children. Their presence was a quiet thunder, a reminder that no sentence would ever restore what had been taken. The proceedings began with the expected rhythm: motions filed, evidence reviewed, discovery debates. Kohberger's defense team challenged the chain of DNA custody, questioned the use of genealogical data, and hinted at procedural violations. But beneath the surface, everyone knew the evidence was overwhelming. Then, for months, nothing. Kohberger remained expressionless, declined to speak publicly, and refused to enter a plea. A judge entered a not guilty plea on his behalf, but the silence wouldn't last. Just weeks before the trial was set to begin, Kohberger's legal team requested a closed-door hearing. Rumors swirled. Was there a deal? New evidence? A change of strategy? And then came the twist. Bryan Kohberger pleaded guilty to the murders of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. No trial, no testimony, no cross-examinations. Just a sudden end to the public pursuit of answers, but not to the pain. During the sentencing hearing, the courtroom transformed. Parents stood, siblings wept. Statements were read aloud, words carved from agony. One father said, "You didn't just kill my daughter. You killed my family, my future, my world." Another asked, "What kind of coward hides behind education to justify horror?" Kohberger, now facing 4 consecutive life sentences without parole, showed no emotion, no apology, no tears. He simply stared forward, as if the entire process was beneath him, or worse, part of some internal experiment. When the judge spoke, his tone cut through the stillness. This was not just murder. This was predation. Calculated. Cold. You were not consumed by rage. You were consumed by control. And with that, Bryan Kohberger was removed from the courtroom for the last time. But for many watching, something still lingered in the air. Not closure, not justice, a void. The kind left when a monster walks among us not as a shadow in the alley, but as the man holding the door open, with a degree in his hand and questions in his eyes. Who is Bryan Kohberger really? Not just the academic, not just the inmate, but the man behind the method, the brain behind the blood. He studied the criminal mind, immersed himself in its theory. He interviewed convicts about their crimes, not to empathize, but to understand mechanism, process, precision, not motive, not morality. Clinical, cold. This wasn't someone who snapped. This was someone who designed. Psychological profiles built from interviews and academic records suggest traits of antisocial personality disorder, perhaps bordering on psychopathy. Kohberger demonstrated a classic need for control over others, emotional detachment, and a disturbing sense of intellectual superiority. He wasn't chasing chaos. He was chasing structure, but a structure he alone would define. People who knew him from graduate school say he was obsessive about details, dismissive of emotional reasoning, and socially isolated. One classmate recalled that he would often dominate discussions about forensic theory, fixating on how investigators make mistakes and how criminals learn to avoid them. A former friend said Kohberger once asked her, "Do you think people are inherently good, or just pretending so they can manipulate the world?" The question, at the time, felt like idle philosophy. In retrospect, it reads like foreshadowing. But what's most chilling is not just what Kohberger did, but how he wanted to be seen. There's a theory in forensic psychology, the scholar slayer, a rare type of offender who uses knowledge of the justice system as a weapon, not a shield. For them, murder is not impulse, it's experiment, a twisted attempt to prove they are smarter than the system they studied. Bryan Kohberger fits that mold disturbingly well. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to do it without being caught, to execute what he believed was a perfect crime, to test his knowledge against reality and win. But he didn't. Instead, he left behind a DNA trail, a digital footprint, a case file that now defines him more than any thesis ever would. And so we're left with a man who, by all accounts, was brilliant. But brilliance without conscience becomes pathology. Intelligence without empathy becomes danger. And a PhD in criminology, that becomes a paper crown. When the court decides you're the monster you thought you were only studying, the sentence has been handed down. 4 consecutive life terms, no parole, no appeal yet. For many, the chapter is closed. The man who haunted an entire town now sits behind bars, surrounded by concrete walls, strip lighting, and the silence he once weaponized. But justice, in cases like this, rarely feels complete. Online forums, true crime communities, legal analysts, everyone continues to dissect every line of court documents, every photograph of the crime scene, every second of the investigation. What drove him? Why those victims? Could someone have stopped him sooner? Even among survivors and the families of the victims, there are different shades of grief. Some demand answers. Others say nothing will ever be enough, and some just want to forget. But the world won't let them. Because this case, like all cases that burrow under the skin, has become something larger. A story about how intelligence can hide malevolence, how a quiet, educated man with no prior record can plan a massacre, and how even in the age of digital footprints and DNA forensics, evil can still move undetected until it decides not to. There are still unanswered questions. Could Kohberger appeal? Could new evidence emerge? Will the case be studied in law schools and psychological journals for decades to come? The answer is almost certainly yes. But maybe the bigger question is not what happens next in the courtroom, but what happens next in our understanding of people like him. What does it say about society when the man who killed for control learned how to kill inside our institutions of higher education? What does it mean that he walked among victims, invisible until he wasn't? And what do we do with the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who spend their lives studying how to appear harmless? Perhaps justice, in its purest form, isn't about a sentence. It's about the uncomfortable truth we're forced to accept, that monsters don't always come in shadows. Sometimes they come with a degree, a quiet smile, and an alibi. This case leaves behind more questions than answers, and we want to hear what you think. Do you believe Bryan Kohberger acted alone? Was this the perfect crime gone wrong? Or something darker beneath the surface? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Whether you followed the Idaho murders since day one, or just now stepped into the case, your insight matters. We read every comment, every theory, every what if. If you found this case as chilling as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. New episodes drop weekly, and we dive deep, one crime at a time. Your voice could uncover something others missed. So go ahead, tell us what justice means to you.